Good morning, everyone. As you're joining us, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're from and maybe what your position is at your agency. Thank you for being here, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Lacey Hensley, and I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. We hope it looks like there's a lot of people joining us from all over, and I'm jealous of all the cooler weather here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I think our high is 105 today. So all these folks that are joining from up north, I wish I was where you're at. But just a little bit of housekeeping. We encourage you to use the the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout today's presentation. Our speaker today is going to be providing lots of opportunity for interaction with everyone. So if you'd like to provide feedback, be sure and use the chat box and make sure that you're responding to everyone so that we can all see what you've written. And if you have any technical difficulties in that instance, you'll select the host and panelist option instead, and I will try to assist you. A little bit about ICCR. We began and were created in 2018 as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative systemic responses to domestic violence. We host monthly trainings geared towards the needs of rural practitioners. In all of our trainings, we work to center the unique needs and strengths of rural communities while providing practical skills and tools that can immediately be implemented. Thank you for being here today and for your dedication to improving your own community's domestic violence response. You can learn more about ICCR at our website, www.instituteccr.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to stay in the loop about all the great trainings that we provide throughout the year. Now on to today's presentation. Jose Juan Lara Jr. is the Systems and Advocacy Senior Program Manager at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Interpretation, Technical Assistance, and Resource Center. With over 20 years of experience in cultural competence and responsiveness, dynamics of gender-based violence, language access, organizational development, and victim advocacy. Jose Juan has presented on these issues, engaging a broad spectrum of multidisciplinary professionals from criminal justice, social services, policy, and health. Jose Juan's previous work experience includes serving as the Senior Manager of Community and Capacity Building for Esperanza United, Director of Advocacy and Training for Texas Advocacy Project in Austin, Director of Legal Services for the Family Crisis Center in Harlingen, Case Manager, Supervisor, Volunteer Coordinator for Court-Appointed Special Advocates of Cameron and Willacy Counties, and Legal Advocate Program Coordinator for Friendship of Women in Brownsville. And I've had the pleasure of working with him, or at least knowing him, for the majority of that last 20 years. So I will give it to you, Jose Juan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lacey, and thank you to the ICCR for inviting the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence to have this conversation around language access, in particular within rural communities. So if y'all give me a minute, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everything will work out. And Lacey, I'm just going to check in with you to see if you can see my screen. Yes, perfect. So there we go. So again, today's conversation is around enhancing language access in rural communities. But before we get into that, I just want to give a little bit more context or information on the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We are a national resource center on domestic violence, sexual violence, trafficking, and other forms of gender-based violence within the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And within that bigger scope of the work, we have the Interpretation Technical Assistance and Resource Center, or ITARC for short, which works to improve systems, response to limited English proficient survivors, victims, community members by providing technical assistance and training on the development and implementation of language access services and training such as this we're having here today. So that could mean also helping organizations develop their own language access plan, doing trainings for staff on issues that intersect with gender-based violence and language access. So for example, a topic we can train on is how language access is a trauma-informed approach to the work around victim advocacy or survivor support advocacy, and so on. And of course, just from the broader perspective, beyond language access, we do a lot of training around how to enhance both linguistically and culture responsive services programs to survivors who identify as part of the Asian Pacific Islander communities. So I would welcome and recommend you all Google us and just go to API-GBV.org. We also have a resource tab with a lot of more information on the different materials we have created over the years. We have a language resource hub as well. And post-training, I'll be sharing those links with Lacey to share with you all, as well as a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation. So, and as you all heard from Lacey's introduction, I am a native Texan, born and raised in Brownsville, Texas. And so I've had over 20 years of experience working at a community-based level as an advocate, working with survivors. And now in the last 8 years of those 20 years, working at the national level, providing these forms of conversations and engagement with all forms of service providers and so on. So welcome and thank you for being here today. So hopefully some of the objectives we'll cover today's conversation or dialogue is just defining meaningful language access as a critical service or advocacy for survivors, victims of these forms of crime. In this case, we're talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family, and so on. But language access really is a service or an approach that really impacts everything we do in our daily lives. Communication is so essential in the work that we do in our private lives, in our professional lives, and so on. So we'll define what meaningful language access is and so on. Also identify the benefits and potential drawbacks of incorporating technology to enhance your language access process for limited English proficient survivors in your communities, right? There is no perfect system, unfortunately. It's just a matter of what benefits you as an organization, what's the best practice, and also looking at peers. What have they developed in their communities to enhance language access from someone who is within a rural community or communities, right? And identify promising practices, as already mentioned, and strategies. We believe here at Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence that peer-to-peer learning is very powerful and very essential. So at some point in this, throughout the presentation, I will pause and ask questions, and hopefully people will engage and share their knowledge around what they've done to build strategies to bridge the gap for survivors who are limited English proficient, who are victims of these forms of gender-based violent crimes, and also all forms of violent crime. Like anything, when we talk about the intersections of gender-based violence, cultural identity, and in this case, we're talking about language access, we always like to start off with just some expectation setting to make sure that we all are on the same page and how we come to this conversation. One of those things is always being mindful, and also, again, it's language access, is the use of language and professional terminology or jargon, right? I will do my best to spell out or vocalize commonly used abbreviations that we use in our professional fields. And I would ask you all the same as well, because again, that's part about language access. And we'll talk a little more about that and give examples. Also understanding this is a dynamic learning space. So I may be talking about things that you may be already aware of, already know, but just keep an open mind and just maybe use this information that may be repetitive to you as validation or affirming to things that you may be instinctively doing or organically processing in your service provision, right, or program development. This is a dialogue and a conversation, right? I can only share the benefit of what I've learned in my 20-some years of doing this work, both at the community-based level, at the statewide level, and as well as the national level, and what I've learned from other peers as well. I don't know what you know, and you don't know what I know, right? So within the possibility, within the limits of this virtual context, there will be moments of pausing throughout the presentation, as I've mentioned, to ask you questions, and I will definitely encourage you to put your responses in the chat or the Q&A, and Lacey will help keep track of those things, right? So please feel free to engage in the conversation. When the understanding that this is a dynamic learning space, which means we may not all have all the answers, and perhaps we are asking a question that perhaps may be a little bit tricky to ask. Again, it's a conversation and a dialogue. And also, again, when we talk about the intersections of gender-based violence, how it impacts different communities, based on their ability to speak a certain language, racial and ethnic identity, and so on, sometimes there may be information that's shared within the space that might be cause people to respond or react a certain way. Hopefully with time, we have enough time, I'll share a couple of videos. If you see that content advisory symbol on the slide, it means just to be aware that there might be images or sounds that might cause people to react or respond in a certain way. So best practice is, let's say the video has a loud baby crying, maybe lowering down the sound in your device, and so on. Again, we never want to traumatize our own community and the work that we do, but just being aware of those things. So just wanted to share some of these goal expectation settings to this conversation and this training. So before we start, again, this is part of the dialogue and conversation part. I just want to ask folks here present, like, what is language access? And if you can please put your answers in the chat or, or in the Q&A, whatever. What is language access, right? And these are questions that, as we go through this conversation, just keep in mind. So what is language access? And Lacey, I'll turn to you and depend on you to keep track of that, those responses. So what is language access? And there's no right or wrong answer, but I just want to know, like, what is language access and how do you define it? And I see people are putting in the chat. Okay. Awesome. So what are some responses coming in, Lacey?
Yeah, so services and resources that enable individuals with limited English proficiency to effectively communicate and access information, affordable or free access to interpreters if needed, being able to communicate with service providers in language you are most comfortable, ability to communicate with people, making services available for all people.
Awesome. So thank
Prov-
you.
yeah, providing
Um,
limited English proficient people reasonable access to the same services as English speaking individuals.
Perfect. So thank you for that. So we're going to move on to the next question. Who are individuals who identify as limited English proficient or LEP? And you all mentioned that. So can someone define what LEP or limited English proficient means, or someone who identifies or is labeled as limited English proficient?
Think they're all
Again,
thinking about it.
again, no right or wrong answer.
Who
This is
doesn't, yeah, sorry, someone who doesn't speak English as first language, someone said not fluent in English.
okay. All right. And that could also mean someone who is native English speaker who may have some level of literacy in the language, right? We often, when we talk about language access, we often, and I'm thinking about this more consistently now that this is the entirety of my work in this universe, is like sometimes limited English proficient people may be native English speakers, right? Who may have some level of literacy around reading and writing and so on. So, okay. So moving on, unless there are other definitions to LEP or limited English proficient person.
Yeah, so preference for another language besides the native language, a person who may
Mhm.
not be able to communicate traditionally through speech. And then someone mentioned, or someone who is deaf or hard of hearing and uses ASL as their primary means of communication.
Yes, great. Thank you for bringing that up. So at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, when we talk about language access, we talk about not just the limited ability to speak from one language into another, but people who use different modes of communication, such as sign language, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but thank you for bringing that up. Another question is, who are deaf or hard of hearing individuals? Since since we already expanded the definition to include people who use sign language. So I kind of gave you the answer already, but who can, if folks can define who are deaf or hard of hearing individuals? Wait here for a moment. And
No
again,
responses yet.
and the reason I'm asking these questions, and again, it's just to kind of for me to have a sense of what is the common language we're using and during this conversation, during this presentation, as well as just so I understand, as I mentioned before, using professional jargon or terminology, that we also have a common definition to these terms. A lot of times when these labels or terms are in reference to people or communities. So, Lacey?
Yeah, one person said folks who are either born deaf or late deafened or have lost their hearing later in life. Someone said people who have lost some or all of their hearing, a person who has limited ability or no ability to hear, someone who's unable to understand language based solely on the ability to hear.
Right. Thank you. And thank you everyone for providing those definitions. And then the last question is, what is the difference between interpretation and translation? So often we use these two terms interchangeably, but they're different. So Lacey?
Yeah, one person added the last part of your previous question that they would also add someone with auditory processing disorder as well.
Yes.
Good point. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for servicing that for us. Yes.
No
So
responses so far. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Translation is written and interpretation is speaking.
Yes, very much so. I'm wondering if there's any different answers to that, Lacey.
Not so far.
Okay. And also, when we talk about, oh, go ahead.
Translation, someone is word to word.
Okay.
And interpretation includes meanings and cultural nuance.
Yes, definitely, right? And even with, so just to summarize, interpretation is from one language to another, right? And then translation is basically written text from one language to another, right? So again, interpretation and translation are not the same thing. And so when we talk about interpreting is the from one language to spoken language from one to another, and then translation from one written language to another. I just remembered this, is that when we talk about language access, it's also creating an environment that is conducive for people to communicate and engage in the conversation or in the mode of their preferred of communication. So for example, when you go to do a training, that you make sure that you have microphones so people can engage, because if we go back to the issue or the question like who are deaf or hard of hearing individuals, it's on a spectrum, right? So it could be folks who have been, who identify and use some type of hearing aid, but there's also folks out there who we don't identify as being deaf or hard of hearing, right? So for example, with me, as I'm getting older, I'm noticing that when I speak to people, or I'm sorry, listening to people who speak at a lower register of their voice, I have a very difficult time hearing to what they're saying or listening to what they're saying, right? Especially if there's a lot of ambient noise. So for those of us, for those of us who do presentations for a living, i.e. best pro tip here is that you ask the event host, ask him if there's going to be microphones. Because, and someone say, well, I speak loud enough. Like, no, you don't. And regardless of whether you're in a small space or in a bigger space, you need that amplification for sound. Because regardless, and you think you speak loud, you really don't, right? Because if regardless of whether the space has amazing acoustics, it really is irrelevant. It's around language access. Again, pro tip, always ask the event host, will you have a microphone sound amplification for the training? And make sure, and for those of you who are in attendance, you know, if you receive federal funding or OVW or OVC or any type of funding like that, it is a requirement when you host your trainings to have language access that also it creates an environment conducive towards that. Pro tip. All right. So thank you for engaging in this Q&A. And again, if colleagues have questions throughout this conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, so I just want to provide also some stats as well. Based on current data that we know, there's over 350 languages spoken globally. Over 350 languages spoken in the US alone, and a little bit over 7,000 languages spoken globally, right? So again, I share these numbers just to put context that these are not just stats, but these are people that live in our communities currently who speak a different language in their home, or different variations of languages spoken in the home. Also, to be aware that between 250,000 and 500,000, or 1%, people of all ages in the US use American Sign Language to communicate as their native language. Also, just like there's different spoken languages in the world, there's also different forms of sign language. So there's Black Sign Language, there's Mexican Sign Language, there's Spanish Sign Language, all different kinds of sign language. So, and also, for those of you who may not know this, and I also learned this, that American Sign Language is a whole different nuanced form of communication. So it's not like English that the way we think it and we speak it is very different, right? So again, just wanted to give some statistics just to give a bigger perspective of who the members in our communities are that speak different languages, as well as perhaps use different modes of communication, in this case, sign language, and being mindful that sign language, just like spoken language, comes in different languages. All right. So moving on. So providing meaningful language access to victims, participants, survivors, community members of crime, right? In this case, we're talking about people who are impacted by family violence, sexual violence, and so on. So providing meaningful language access, what does that mean? But before we go into that conversation, again, another moment of conversation and dialogue and engagement. How do barriers to language access impact a survivor, a crime victim, rights? How do barriers to language access impact a crime victim's rights? And Lacey, I turn to you as folks put in the chat.
No responses yet.
Think about it. How do barriers to language access impact a crime victim's rights?
Yeah, someone said frustration.
Mm.
Survivors may be unable to realize victims' rights. It makes it difficult to seek help. Individual may receive false information from the perpetrator. It can cause an inability to have a full understanding of a crime victim's rights, or they may not be able to access services. They won't know their rights if they are only offered in English.
Yes. Yes. So again, think about all that you do and the different points of access to information to your services, agency, organization, community-based organization, what have you. Think about all the access points of information that survivors, in this case, who are limited English proficient or use different modes of communication, would have challenges accessing, knowing their rights as a victim of crime, right? And how to apply for those services and so on. Again, it's
couple.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
We had a couple more. Limited or poor interaction with service providers. Informed consent was the phrase. Someone was talking about an inability to have a full informed consent of their rights.
Yes, definitely. And that is core to our advocacy, right? To make sure that a survivor, a victim of crime, a community member, participant, even our own family members, or even maybe ourselves, are able to engage in the process, to have informed consent, to understand how the process works, right? Again, I reference back around language access is not just from one language to another, but also understanding the professional jargon we use on a daily basis. Is it linguistically accessible and understood by that person or community members, right? Thank you. So moving forward, again, just a lot of questions here. Since we're talking about enhancing access in rural communities, I want to pause here for a moment and kind of ask you these questions like, what are some unique language access issues survivors in rural communities, right? Just, what are some of those unique things, just considering what you know and what we've shared here perhaps, or what you've experienced, like what are some of those unique language access issues survivors in rural communities encounter that you've experienced, have seen?
No comment yet.
And then while people are percolating and thinking about the answer, the next question I would ask you is, what's it like to access interpreters and translators in your rural communities, right? What have been those challenges? You as a service provider, collaborating with other organizations to help provide support, advocacy, protect the rights of survivors. Lacey?
Yeah, lack of interpreters is the only feedback so far. Oh, okay. Misunderstandings with law enforcement regarding incidents of violence, language appropriate services, service referrals not offered, hard to find services that are affordable to our agency, information's not available in their preferred language or spoken language, lack of understanding of various cultures, time it takes to find an interpreter. Someone said in ARIA, it's very uncommon for any of us to speak a language other than English. Interpreters aren't readily available, and it can be difficult to find translators for documents. Hard to have interpreters over the phone. Lack of cell reception for organizations that use services like Language Line for telephonic interpretation services.
Yes, all those things, right? And then the last question is, what could make language access easier? And just think about in the ideal, like if you had all these things, all the answers to what y'all shared, like what could make language access easier? Just think about it.
Create language access community hubs, free
Mhm.
hotlines with interpreters for speedy use.
Yes. I love the word for sure.
Create
Yeah,
cultural and linguistic partnerships.
yes, definitely, definitely, definitely. Um, so it actually starts with developing a language access plan, right? And so I ask you, like, how many of you have a language access plan as part of your organization standard operating procedures? And do you know where to find your language access plan, right? And often when I ask this question, people will respond, well, we use the language line. That's a part of language access, but it's not a language access plan, right? And if we have more time, we'll talk more about it. But that's a whole nother presentation. Lacey, you had.
Yeah, so another what would make language access easier, hiring more people that speak multiple languages. Someone shared in our program, we're starting to have all of our documents translated into different languages and have Braille. We also have language line to use. And then another comment, making sure that service providers understand this is not just important, but vital.
Yes. And those things that you just mentioned, Lacey, or shared are part of your language access plan, right? And part of the bigger piece of that is budgeting, right? Creating a line item in your budget. And some of you may work for multi-social service agencies or organizations, and some of you may have your own individualized budgets. So making sure you incorporate language access in your budgets and in respective programs or divisions, right? So again, yeah, so thank you again. And so we'll delve deeper into some of these questions. But again, if you have any questions, please make sure to write them in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, so what is meaningful language access? So another question for you all here is like, what is, taking into account what we've shared so far, what I've mentioned, what is meaningful access to you? When we hear just the word meaningful access, what does that mean to you? And you've already shared some of those responses, but what is meaningful access? And when we talk about language as well, what is meaningful access?
They're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said we have a packet called I Speak cards that have all the languages listed for someone to identify their language. You pass them out to law enforcement and each of the direct services programs for use.
Okay, good. Right, so that's meaningful.
Making sure that people get what they need regardless of language.
Right.
Access
Yes.
that makes services usable for all, making sure that all people are able to access your services easily, accessible. When you say all languages, how do you identify the all?
Good question. How do you identify the all? Does anyone have any answer?
We also have access to an understanding of assistive technology for folks with communication needs, quick and readily available, especially in times of crisis, access that is timely and useful.
Yes. So if someone hasn't responded to the question, though, how do you define all? So part of your language access plan would be assessing the languages that are spoken in your community, right? And again, I'll give you links to, like, for example, not for example, but Esperanza United, they have an online language access toolkit that gives you step by step on how to develop a language access plan, as well as a template, a generic language access plan to adapt to your circumstances. But it starts with assessing the linguistic capabilities or points of access or services in your community, right? And a lot of that information you can get from your schools, hospitals, because if any organization, agency, or community-based nonprofit that receives federal funding, VOCA, from OVW, OVC, and so on, which I'm assuming a lot of you here do, are required to have a language access plan, right? And so this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a service area that here at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, we are able to provide technical assistance to you all as well. So again,
Someone,
thank you. Yes.
so Jose Juan, someone asked if you could repeat the name of the toolkit.
Yes. So if you Google Esperanza United, just go to their website and then click on the tab that says knowledge base, and then go to their online toolkits. It's listed there. Again, I'll send the link to all that information to Lacey so she can share with you all. I know this because I used to work there before, as already mentioned. So it's a great tool. It's a step-by-step process. And Esperanza United, similar to us, they're also another national culture-specific resource center on domestic violence and sexual assault within the Latino, Latina, Latinx communities. So great resource as well to reach out to. All right. So moving forward, meaningful access is defined by the U.S. Department of Justice in their own language access plan. Is, as some of you already mentioned, these things: accurate, timely, effective communication at no cost to the limited English proficient individual, access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to programs or activities provided by English proficient individuals. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and just kind of say, as we mentioned, as I share this information with you, of course, this is in the ideal sense, right? In the perfect world, but that's why we're having this conversation, right? And again, planning for language access is planning. Just like anything we do with survivors requires planning. So, and you already know how to do this. For example, when a survivor of family violence comes to shelter, what do we do? You know, what are one of the first priority things that we do with a survivor is we do safety planning, right? And as part of your safety planning, does that also includes language access, right? So again, you already have the basic skills, it's just nuancing it to this perspective. And some of the tools that we use around providing meaningful language access, and some of you already mentioned this, is having bilingual and maybe also bicultural staff to help the process, but also being in mind that if you have bilingual and bicultural staff in your organization, they are not your they're not your organization's interpreter or translator. Being an interpreter and a translator requires a different specialized skill set that is more rigorous and more specific. Another tool to provide meaningful access is having interpreting or providing interpretation. As some of you already know, use the language line. That's one way, in person as well. And then translation. Some of you already mentioned this, having your written materials as well as your online presence, electronic presence, translate the language translated into other languages that perhaps are more commonly used in your communities. But also don't forget those languages that are also of lesser diffusion, right? Because we often forget those community members. So these are just some tools of providing meaningful language access, as well as technology, which we'll get into this in a minute. So Lacey, I just want to pause you. I'm just going to turn and see if there's any other comments or observations shared in the space.
No, no, but we were able to provide the link to the Esperanza United toolkit.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Thank you. Again, these are just some ways of providing meaningful access, meaningful language access. So talk about technology. How do we use it? How do you use it in your community and so on? So a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So I just want to share this image with you just to see what it all takes for a survivor who is limited English proficient to access the different points of information. In this case, we're dealing with a survivor or advocating with a survivor who is engaging, who has decided to engage the criminal justice system, right? In this scenario is someone who is also an immigrant survivor who's limited English proficient. So just, you can all see the different points of language access that may be needed from that system, right? So also taking this image and also looking inwardly into your organization's different points of access for information for community members to get services from you all, right? What does it take to get that information, right? And again, not just referencing or supporting or enhancing access to survivors who speak a different language, but also who may use different modes of communication, right? So again, looking at this broadly, looking at the different steps. Another thing we also recommend systems, particularly court systems, is to do a systems map of what it takes for a litigant to access the services just to get to the physical front steps of the building and moving forward, right? From point A to point B and so on, right? And this is an area of capacity building around systems mapping that the Center for Justice Innovation as well provides training and technical assistance. Definitely reach out to them. A lot of you here probably already are aware of this Center for Justice Innovation, CJI, formerly Center for Court Innovation, CCI. Amazing people. I know a lot of amazing people out there that work there. So again, systems mapping and incorporating language access is part of that. Just Lacey, I'm just kind of checking to see if there's any questions or comments or observations.
Someone just, and looking at this graphic, said, wow, that sure gives a different perspective. And then another individual wanted to see if we could make this graphic available.
Yes, it'll be part of your PowerPoint slide, but also give acknowledgement to the source if you're going to use it. So yeah, and again, the best way to understand the barriers, particularly for survivors from diverse communities, in this case, survivors who are limited English proficient or use different modes of communication, is doing a systems map of what it takes to access those services, right? And also for those of you who are specifically identified as community-based domestic violence and rape crisis centers, one of the recommendations we always offer or engage in conversation with organizations, whether your DV or SA centers or whatever, is like maybe doing a community-based assessment and see what community thinks of accessing your services, what it requires, and so on. So ultimately, the goal, whether you're in rural communities or whatever communities you're in, is a seamless advocacy experience, right? So the questions to ask yourself, and some of you may already be in different areas of process around incorporating different modes of technology to enhance access, or linguistic access in this case. Is the technology you use creating barriers to access or breaking them down, right? So as we go on to this next phase of the training, is like, have these questions in mind. Is the technology you use creating barriers to access or breaking them down, right? Are individuals able to access information easily and efficiently in the language they prefer, or are they faced with a frustrating experience due to complicated processes, right? And then the last question is language access provided in a way that is victim-centered? Which means also making sure that for those of you who use LanguageLine or considering using LanguageLine, to vet that service provider who provides interpretation and translation services. Ask them, are your interpreters certified? Whether they're court certified or medically certified interpreters, are they trained in trauma-informed interpretation? What type of trainings have they done on trauma-informed? Are the interpreters experienced interpreting for victims of crime, particularly violent crime, right? This is important to ask any service provider that they claim they specialize in, interpretation for victims, or, they provide interpretation and translation for court situations and so on. Ask them those questions, right? For example, we had a interpretation and translation service provider reach out to us. I called them. I went down my list. I asked them those questions, and the response was, I need to ask my supervisor that. I need to ask again, because we're providing life-saving information, right? So we want to make sure that if you're going to incorporate technology, does it create barriers or does it enhance it, and so on. So some of these forms of integration of technology for hopefully solving some of those interpretation and translation issues or barriers, or minimizing rather, is on-site interpreting, video remote interpreting or VRI, over the phone interpreting or telephonic interpretation, otherwise known as, and remote simultaneous interpreting. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask you all, can someone define these terms for us, or do people understand what on-site interpreting is, what video remote interpreting or VRI is, or telephonic interpreting and remote simultaneous interpreting? Has anyone heard these terms before, or already as part of your service plan around language access? And
We're
of course,
waiting for responses.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I'm going to take a sip of water. Yeah, so what is on-site interpreting?
On-site would be someone physically there on site. Someone said, I'm guessing OSI is in person, video is like Zoom, etc., and then OPI is via telephone. Yes, VRI for ASL.
Yes,
and VRI, an interpreter located in a different physical location than the participants, joins the conversation through a video conferencing platform.
Yes. So, yes. So thank you all for answering those questions. Of course, the ideal and the most perfect way of providing language access is, of course, having in-person interpreters. But sometimes that is not possible, particularly in rural communities that you may be dependent on technologies to enhance remote language access. But again, just like there's solutions, there's also complexities to these opportunities to minimize barriers for people who are limited English proficient or use different modes of communication. So,
Jose Juan, can I stop you for just a second? I am personally not familiar with the remote simultaneous interpreting. Can you, I'm assuming maybe there's one other person that might not know what that is. Can you share what that is?
Oh, well, I'll turn the question to the audience members. Does anyone like to try and define remote simultaneous interpretation? Again, no right or wrong answers.
Okay, we had, they listen to the speaker's message and provide simultaneous interpretation.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, I'm gonna give you all a break. I'm going to give you a break, but so at RSI, or remote simultaneous interpreting, I'm going to read the definitions from here. Is simultaneous interpreting is when the interpreter interprets what's being said as the speaker is talking instead of waiting for them to finish, right? So for example, let's say someone in the audience today had requested interpretation into Spanish. Zoom has the ability where you set it up for that to happen. And so the instructions would be for that person to go scroll down on their screen, click on the icon that says interpretation, and then click on the language they need interpretation to. And so now they're in a different channel per se. And so I'm still talking and that interpreter is interpreting what I'm saying in real time. Does that make sense? And it's remote.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. See how complex language access is, terminology, and so on. So thank you for that question. So now I'm going to share a video. It's about 4 3-minute video that kind of exemplifies video relay services, or VRS. And this is from adapted from the Translating Justice, Achieving Language Access for Crime Victims Module 6. And this is a training or a curriculum that was developed in conjunction with us, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Esperanza United, Vera Institute of Justice, as well as, I'm forgetting, I think, a fourth organization. But yeah, And then Lacey, please let me know if the sound is not coming through. And as you experience this video, I want you to think about certain things, like ask yourself, have we gone through this in our organization or in our rural communities? What was I feeling, hearing, seeing, and so on? And we'll debrief afterwards, very briefly.
Hello, 911. What's the nature of your emergency?
Hello, this is an emergency call through Sorensen Video Relay Service. I'm interpreter 3200, interpreting for a person who uses sign language to communicate. There may be some pauses. And your caller is saying, I have an emergency situation. My husband has fallen from a ladder, and he is now laying on his back. He's unable to move, and his back is hurting him pretty bad.
What address are you calling from?
My address is 64 Park Street, Lindstrom, Minnesota.
Are you with your husband right now?
Yes, well, he's just right outside the door. I can see him through the window. I can see him.
Is he conscious?
Yes, he's conscious.
And how far did he fall?
I would say maybe 6 to 7 feet.
Can you tell what part of his body's been injured?
No, you can't see anything, but he told me that his legs are hurting because, well, he can't move them, and his back he's having a lot of pain. It's pretty severe.
Is there any serious bleeding?
No, no bleeding.
Okay, I'm sending the paramedics to help you now. Stay on the line and I'll tell you exactly what to do next. Do not move him unless he's in danger. And do not splint any injuries.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, just kind of check in with everyone just to see what people saw, heard, felt. If you've encountered similar situations in your service provision, in your organization, did you learn something new in this process? Just want to check in here for briefly. And
No comment so far.
If people or people notice any kind of the layers to this process, is it easy? Is it just a matter of, yes, let's do this?
So we have, it's comforting to know the services out there. Someone else mentioned it must be very frustrating to have to repeat yourself.
Mhm. Yeah.
One thing
So again,
I personally thought of is when usually, 911 will give the medical protocols. And if you're right there having to continue to, communicate with the video, you can't be there comforting your loved one who's in pain.
right. So again, thinking about all the nuances to providing linguistic accessible services, right?
Yeah, someone said, as an EMT, I know some basic sign and can communicate. We also have a local ASL interpreter. Someone said it takes a bit more time, but I like that services are available. Someone else said, or providing CPR if needed. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And again, just being mindful that sign language is not universal, right? One thing to also be mindful that learning American Sign Language can be an issue of access to resources. And so you may have someone who may have learned just develop their own form of sign language to communicate. And so, so just being mindful of those things as well. So again, don't assume the person is using American Sign Language. They could be use other forms of sign to communicate. And any others under observations, Lacey?
Someone just asked, is there a disconnect between the video and when the paramedics arrive?
What do you mean? What do they mean by that?
I don't know. I'm assuming maybe, do they have to disconnect the call between time? I'm not real sure.
It might have to, because they have to provide the emergency
No,
assistance.
do the paramedics have a video service with them? Okay, thank you.
Well, that's a good question.
So it's probably that dispatch is relaying that information to paramedics as they arrive on scene.
Mhm. Yeah. So again, just these extra layers that require consistent, cost-effective, timely, and accurate language access. I'm just looking at time here, so I think we do have time to show the next video. Again, just think about the experience of this video, similar questions like, what to think about, have I experienced this before, any questions? So press play.
Bueno.
Good morning, Miss Garcia. This is Miss Avery from Children's Services.
Oh, okay.
One moment, please, okay? Un momento. I'm going to get an interpreter on the line to help us, okay?
Okay.
Welcome to Interpreter Services for the Administration for Children's Services. For Spanish, press 1. For all other languages, press 2.
Hi, this is Beatriz, number 22091. What is your phone access code?
ACSC08
Okay, what is your user ID number?
0820XX.
Okay, and how may I help you today?
Hi, this is Miss Avery with the Administration for Children's Services. I have a Spanish-speaking client on the line. Let's start.
Okay.
Miss Garcia?
Hello.
Hi, Miss Garcia, the interpreter is on the line,
Okay.
and she will help us communicate.
Hola, me llamo Beatriz y seré su intérprete por el día de hoy.
Oh, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Ms. Garcia, please speak directly to me, and the interpreter will interpret what you say and what I say.
Okay, señora García, por favor hable directamente a la señora Avery y yo interpretaré exactamente lo que usted diga y lo que ella diga.
Okay.
Okay.
Ms. Garcia, how are you? How are things with your daughter?
Okay, señora García, ¿cómo está? ¿Está todo bien con su hija?
Bueno, todo se está mejorando. Dolores está más calmada ahora.
Okay, everything is getting better, thanks. Dolores is much calmer now.
Great, Miss Garcia. I would like to arrange a follow-up home visit.
Qué bueno, señora García, me gustaría arreglar una visita a su casa.
Can I come by next Thursday about 3 p.m.?
Okay, ¿podría pasar por su casa el jueves en la tarde a las 3?
Bueno, sí, estaremos aquí el jueves que viene a las 3 de la tarde.
We will be here next Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m.
So I will see you next Thursday at 3 p.m. and I will have an interpreter with me.
Okay, qué bueno. So la veré a las 3 de la tarde el jueves en su casa y tendré un intérprete conmigo.
Pero también le quería preguntar sobre las sesiones de consejería para mi hija.
But I also want to ask you about counseling sessions for my daughter.
Sure. I'll bring some information about programs in Spanish, and when I get there, we can discuss the options.
Okay, sí. Yo traeré información acerca de los programas en español y podemos hablar de las opciones cuando la vea.
Ok, muchas gracias.
All right, thank you very much.
Ms. Garcia, is there anything else I can help you with?
Oh, señora García, ¿hay algo más en que le pueda ayudar?
No me hace falta más nada.
No, I don't need anything else.
If you need anything, Ms. Garcia, please call.
Okay, señora García, si necesita algo, por favor, llame.
Ok, está bien, gracias.
Okay, thank you. Okay, señora García, buen día. Okay, Miss Aries, anything else I can help you with?
No, thank you. End call.
Okay. So very briefly or quickly, has anyone had that experience using the language line? Any differences perhaps when you use language line? Was there any difference in protocol? But that's pretty much standard.
So we had someone share that they used to work for a 911 center. My only experience was interpretation over the phone. It was a language barrier. She spoke Vietnamese, no English. Paramedics on scene did not speak it. So our dispatcher had to stay on the phone with the caller and the interpreter, get the info and relay it to our radios to relay it to the paramedics and vice versa. I imagine that delays medical care for sure.
Right.
Someone else said as pretty much standard as far as the video. Takes more time, but very cool to know that services are out there.
Right. And so again, and one of the things I would add to, and we'll send this, Lacey, to you so you can share with everyone here. We have a how to work with interpreters fact sheet. Is also in our case is if giving the interpreter the heads up that they're going to be interpreting for a victim of crime. Because again, as I mentioned before, that can be an issue. Some of the things we've heard across the country is that the advocate will call the language line and all of a sudden they're having to provide crisis intervention for the interpreter because they're triggered, which draws away the center from the survivor. Or there may be issues where, and I've heard this happen too, and this is why you need to vet those language line service or interpretation and translation service providers. They just completely refuse to interpret the situation. Completely, right? And you as an organization that's in a rural community and maybe language line is your main form of enhancing linguistic services or access, you need to make sure that that is not an issue, right? True stories. So again, this is pretty much standard, but I would take a step further. And if you're calling to use language line or whether it's video remote interpretation or whatever, that you prepare the interpreter that this is the type of interpretation you're about to engage in. Because that could happen, and it has happened. Okay, moving on. So as kind of alluding to this, it's a good segue, is just understanding the limitations of technology and its use. You know, for video remote interpreting, they are just like has potential opportunity to minimize barriers, but also there's limitations. You know, with video remote interpreting, there's visual limitations. There may be cognitive difficulties or impairments. So again, the two videos I just showed you are the ideal. There's no, even with the video where the person uses sign language, it was a relatively calm situation, but I know in the cases that we intervene, they're not calm, right? The person may be impacted by the traumatic event, and so on. And we know based on research that traumatic events does impact a person's linguistic ability to communicate, whether they're native English speakers, even more so if they might be bilingual in some sense, or just limited English proficient. Communication idiosyncrasies for video remote interpreting interpreters are not familiar with. Again, language has flourishes and colors to it, right? So we need to make sure that whoever is providing the interpretation, that they understand the cultural nuances of the language that's being used. And in the case of Spanish, not all Spanish that is being used is used the same way. So the way I learned Spanish in Brownsville, Texas may be different the way I use it, express it from someone who's from Puerto Rico, from Chile, Argentina, and so on. The other thing we need to address is the digital divide. Many rural communities may not have the adequately equipped with high-speed broadband infrastructures. And we certainly learned that lesson the hard way during COVID, right? And we're still adapting to the circumstance, right? So again, just being mindful of that and how it could impact certain communities who use different modes of communication or limited English proficient, or technology just goes wrong, right? On the early onset of COVID, and for us having to pivot to use online platforms like Zoom and so on, the technology just went wrong. Some of it had to do with human error. Some of it had to do with the capacity of the technology and just learning how to navigate through those issues and problems, right? So again, just factoring those problems that could occur and how do you address them if those happen. Again, your language access plan would help you address those issues if those technology difficulties were to come up. Lacey.
Yeah, we had someone share, I've had an unfortunate experiences where the interpreter and victim have argued, or the interpreter becomes upset or angry with the victim.
Yes. And the other things you also have to be aware of, and this is also addressed in that How to Work with Interpreters fact sheet, is that, let's say in the case of providing language access and court interpreter, and I emphasize court certified interpreter in a court hearing, you may have someone who is a native speaker. He's an interpreter, but is a native speaker of that language. There might be some cultural barriers happening there. There's been situations where the interpreter who is part of the community, as well as speaking the language, often may dissuade the victim, the person, from proceeding with the protective order, the divorce, or whatever, right? So having to be aware of those cultural nuances as well. So pro tip. Moving forward, more limitations on video VRS is, regulated by the Federal Commissions of Communications. FCC limits the use of free service to phone calls, requires all deaf and hearing participants to be in separate locations. Again, when you are incorporating, especially for rural communities that depend on technology to enhance language access, again, this would be part of your language access plan, addressing these barriers. So whoever is providing language access at the time, if this happens, use this. If this happens, do that. Not intended to replace in-person interpreting services. Again, in the ideal world, it's always better to have in-person interpretation or language access. Some of you may be familiar with using CART or communication access real-time translation or speech-to-text captioning. Pool of providers is limited. Some of you mentioned or referenced this already. Need teleconferencing access. May need information on information in advance, requires more planning. Again, your language access plan would account for all those things. Let's see. Telephonic or over the phone interpreting. some limitations and drawbacks, quality control. The person may be calling from a very noisy place or whatever, potential for talking over, a lack of consistency, no relationship building, can feel impersonal, which the phone then equals to barriers. We've also heard, and during COVID, a lot of us, again, as I mentioned, had to pivot to depending on technology to continue services. A lot of it was over the phone, with Zoom, and so on. From what we've heard is that for some survivor communities, remote access is better for them. Some of the things that were mentioned was because they don't have to go in person to the organization, which may cause them to be exposed in the community. And also remind ourselves that when we're providing services to survivors from diverse communities, these are pocket communities, right? It allows for more anonymity, more confidentiality to some extent. But then there's also the converse to that, some survivors say, I prefer in person because, just like it's mentioned here, I felt like I wasn't being validated or wasn't taking what I'm sharing as important, right? So you have to kind of balance all these things. It's not just about the actual technical limitations and drawbacks of using the technology, but how different communities use the technology. Is there the digital divide and so on? From the deaf and blind communicator, unfamiliarity, unease. Again, these are technologies perhaps you may not familiar using, but should be part of your language access plan. And just in case, this is how the technology is used. And then when not to use technology, the client comfort, right? Are they comfortable using the technology? Again, part of your planning and using any form of technology to enhance access is making sure you also inform of its use to the community member, survivor, and even peers, right? So, for example, now when I'm doing a webinar using Zoom, and if it's us hosting it and we have an invited presenter, I like to meet with them. I like to ask them, this is how we use the platform. We use Zoom meeting instead of Zoom webinar. Do you like to engage? And these are the features that we use, and so on. The same protocol should apply when you're limited by certain technology use in your rural communities. User of sign language other than ASL, again. Intimidation, not a techie, Some of us still have challenges navigating Zoom, and it seems like every other month Zoom is upgrading the features of the technology, and as we get better at online virtual world communication, again, just keeping your own ability to use the technology, lack of quality, disability, privacy concerns, complexity of the situation, as some of you have mentioned already, user of manual communication, again, just things to consider when technology may not be the most appropriate to use to enhance access. And then again, keeping in mind that when you are doing your language access planning in your own organization, looking at how other organizations, service providers, agencies, departments use technology in rural communities to enhance language access, right? That means courts, that means crisis centers, law enforcement, other social service providers, schools, community health providers, right? And also, if you don't have the technology or have limited technology use to enhance access, maybe partnering and asking the school, let's say you have to do some kind of parent conference teacher thing, right? Reach out to the school and ask them, what type of technology do you use to, because this is the client, this is survivor, and so on, right? Ask these folks, how do you use their technology, right? And what type of, do they have a language access plan? And does that also include the use of technology? That is our responsibility. And then just things to consider as because this is a very short time we have together to talk about these issues, right? But just things to consider is like, what technology do you feel you could use in your agency, organization, department, right? What are some pitfalls or obstacles to their use that you see in your agency? Maybe you've adapted language line, right? Great. So now how can we enhance that technology to include remote video conferencing and so on? If you have assistive devices, do people in your agency know how to use it? Does everyone in your organization know how to use these technologies? How to contact the language line, all that. Are they maintained, right? Is there training on these devices, right? And Zoom does provide webinars on how to use their features to its full capacity, and all of those things, right? So again, just things to consider, to have more thought when you're providing and developing your language access plan in rural communities, right? And it requires it's an organization-wide and even community-wide process, but just bringing it to your own agency, department, or organization, like agency quality assurance, right? One of the pieces or one of the sections in the Esperanzas United Online Language Access Toolkit is a whole section dedicated to quality assurance and monitoring, right? And a language access plan, just like any document that dictates the terms of standard operating procedures, is a living document. So in the ideal world, just like you would update your personnel policies and procedures maybe every 2 years, or update your strategic plan as an organization, you would do the same with your language access plan. Client evaluation, again, getting feedback from people after they've used the service from all aspects. Like if you were providing advocacy support to a limited English proficient survivor or person who uses different modes of communication like sign language, ask for feedback, right? And again, organizational plan. This requires an organizational assessment around language access, or even just go broader. How are we improving both linguistically and culturally responsive services and program development for survivors from diverse communities? In this case, we're talking about limited English proficient survivors or people who use different modes of communication, right? And at the end of the day, it's victim-centered, survivor-centered practices, which are things that you already are doing. It's around making sure that language access, as we've mentioned, it enhances safety. It empowers people, it makes them feel comfortable, it makes them feel like we are understanding, we are comprehending. It's about providing choices, right? The work that we do as advocates is providing options and clarifying and explaining those options, trauma-informed at the core of everything that we do, and also communicative autonomy. This means that the person is able to communicate their needs, their wants, their concerns in the language that they're comfortable in. That also includes native English speakers, right? And our role as advocates or service providers is to break down that process, right? And so again, it's just basic, fundamental, victim-centered, survivor-centered, community-centered, community-engaged practices that are linguistically and culturally responsive. And the goals are, we've talked about providing meaningful access, timely, effective, foster equity, right? Encourage full participation. And then why should we care? If that's not enough for you, the touchy-feely stuff or whatever, let's look at the laws, the federal regulations that are out there that say we will have, if you receive any type of federal funding, which is most of us here, is you will have a language access plan, right? Executive Order 13166 clarifies that very clearly. Americans with Disabilities Act, the Violence Against Women Act, Victims of Crime Act, and then the Crime Victims Bill of Rights. Every state has its own rendition of the Crime Victims Bill of Rights. And it's fundamental to what we do as advocates, right? And how we do this work. So I want to read some of the points around the crime victims' rights at the federal level, because I think it's so important. And so, which I think to me, if you read this, it kind of infers language access is the right to reasonable, accurate, and timely notice of public court proceedings, etc. And didn't we mention those things when we were defining meaningful language access, accurate and timely, right? Another crime victim right, the right to not be excluded from any such public court proceedings, and etc., which requires communication, right? Even for folks who are native English speaker, because we love to use professional jargon, right? And doing this 20 some years, I still have to read through court orders and try to understand that. The right to be treated with fairness and with respect, to me, that's due process, which means, again, going back to the other right is not to be excluded from any proceeding, right? The right to be informed in a timely manner, which means making sure that the person understands the information, the court hearing proceedings, whatever service is being provided to them, especially if they are a victim or survivor of crime. And, you know, we know based on research, just generally speaking, when we apply a survivor-centered approach, which includes meaningful language access based on research, survivor communities or the person going through the situation, they are more likely to seek out services, right? If it's specifically, if it's linguistically and culturally accessible. It enhances safety for the person. So if the person understands what's going on, the limitations of an order of protection and all those things, it enhances safety. Appreciate and feel more supported at the end, right? Again, fundamental survivor-centered, crime victim-centered approaches here. So we're at the end of the conversation here today. And I don't know how much time we have left, Lacey, but just want to pause here and just, you know, if there's any questions, you know, observations people would like to share at this moment. Yeah, any other comments being shared?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Someone had to run early, but said that they was a great presentation. Thank you so much for the information. Don't see any other questions right now. One comment I wanted to make in thinking about everything that you've been saying is just the role that language access, I feel like, needs to play in your CCR work, and having maybe a language plan for your CCR, right? Or in talking about that, just to make sure that your systems advocates and community advocates and all parties involved are on the same page. Because I know in rural communities, hopefully we're past this, but with the lack of interpreters, using like a family member or a child, like just to gain basic information, especially in a crisis or an issue with safety, but just how all the nuances that brings into the scenario as well.
Right. And again, you know, I definitely don't want to seem like I'm pointing fingers saying you need to do this and you need to do that, but that's my job here right now, right? We have to look at from floor to ceiling, right? And having a high level of practice, because as I mentioned, we are providing life-altering, life-saving services. And if, again, even just native English speakers, if they don't understand the various options we're providing, it could really mess someone up physically, emotionally, financially, and so on, right? So imagine someone who is limited English proficient and then also dealing with the trauma of escaping, not leaving, escaping a proactive abusive partner, family member, whatever, right? So I just wanted to kind of surface that, you know, we at Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, especially when we deal around technical assistance around language access, it's a thought partnership, right? And yes, one of the things we always recommend organizations, and we've done this with state agencies, community-based organizations, and so on, is that build your own internal committee or group that addresses all these barriers to access based on linguistic or cultural identity for survivors from diverse communities, right? And within that conversation, also look at the physical space that you're in, you know, is it accessible? You know, when you're considering to to purchase a new building, if you have that kind of money and have that kind of fundraising, you know, or maybe looking to lease a new space that's more nice, it's more centered downtown, is it really accessible physically for the general communities that you're going to engage in? All these things, right? So again, just thinking about these things through, and we again recommending that creating your own internal committee that addresses these things around language access. And honestly, in my theoretical assumption or approach is that if you develop a language access plan, it's probably the most concrete example of developing a culturally responsive plan, right? It really is. It really is.
Yeah, definitely. Agreed. Couple comments. Great training. You've made some great points. I can really see where our programs can be improved or be made more comprehensive for people with limited English proficiency. Another comment, thank you, wonderful presentation. And then in a previous job, someone shared as a probation officer, I had to have the child interpret between me and the parent. I knew that was not interpreting everything that I was saying due to her parents' facial reactions. However, living in a rural county, I was limited in resources. As a result, I gave the parents written documentations that we used to communicate back and forth.
Right.
Someone else mentioned, very, very informative. Thank you for offering conducting this webinar. We rarely have a need for interpreters, translators, so I'm not real comfortable with this process, and this helps a lot. Videos were great and very useful. Thank you. It was very informative, which I agree. Very informative, and things that you just don't think about, really. I mean, unless you have a very an intentional conversation about it and all the aspects that it involves.
Right. And again, you know, here at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, we're here to help support you in that journey around developing your own language access planning and processes, right? It's a journey, it's a process, right? And working within your strengths and abilities and so on, right? But it's what we prioritize in the work, right? It's what we prioritize in our budgets. And so, you know, leadership decision makers are a very important part of this conversation for sure. And some of you may be decision makers. Some of you may influence your annual budgets in your organizations. You know, definitely think about, you know, incorporating a line item around language access. So that includes, you know, paying for language line, paying for translation of materials, and having quality control processes around that, because we've had situations where people translate materials and they're not using the colloquial language that's being used in the community, right? And within reason. And again, you know, there's so many ways to deal with this, but developing a language access plan is the first step. Just like you do safety planning with people, we don't want to react, we want to respond, right? And so we're here to support. We don't have all the answers, but definitely we don't, you know, I've mentioned a couple of other resource centers at the center, like the Center for Justice Innovation. They do also some language access stuff. They do systems mapping, training, and technical assistance. Reach out to them. You know, there's the Center for State Courts, the National Center for State Courts. They also have a great online resource around glossaries of commonly used legal terms in domestic violence proceedings in different languages that y'all can access. And and Lacey, I'll give you that whole list there too.
That's great.
So there's a lot of national OVW funded resource centers that do a lot of work around language access in different fields of practice, like judges, law enforcement, service providers like ourselves, culturally specific stuff as well. So you're not alone. You're not alone in this process. And also here at Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, we are also learning. We learn. And then, like I said, you all may have developed strategies, especially in rural communities, around how to use technology that maybe you want to share with your colleagues as well, right? Because again, y'all are the front lines. Your communities are very different and vast and complex. And just being in a rural community adds that different flavor to it. You know, and I know that in Texas, we have 254 counties in the state of Texas, right? Majority rural. There's a twang going on, right? And so just understanding those limitations, but look at the strengths of it also, right? And yes, we'll be sharing the slides as well. And like I said, I'll be sending a list of resources with hyperlinks to all that to Lacey.
Great. And one thing, I may have interrupted your slide prematurely. Do you have your contact information that you could share on your last slide there? If you want to share your screen again so folks can get in touch. And then also I will send a follow-up email with the information, and it will be available on our website.
There it is.
There.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then it'll be in the slide there too. So yeah, you'll have all that information as well.
Wonderful. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I am going to just add a couple of more items here at the very end. Want you to be aware of our next monthly webinar on July 25th. We're going to be hearing from Dr. David Scott on using risk assessments within high-risk interventions. And registration is required, and you can use the QR code there at the bottom of your screen. Also, it is available on our website under upcoming events. And then we're excited to announce our 3rd annual virtual rural conference. It's going to be October 2nd and 3rd. This year, we're partnering with the Rural Justice Collaborative to highlight the specific needs of survivors experiencing substance use and intimate partner violence, and registration will be opening very soon. Check back on our website and watch your email for more information. And then finally, our RFPs for 2024 Conference on Crimes Against Women are now open. You can access the submission link on our website under the speaker tab or by scanning the QR code there as well. And I'll leave that up for just a minute. But thank you for joining us today. At the end of your webinar, when I end the webinar, you will have a survey that populates in your browser. Please take a moment to complete it in order to review your certificate. The survey link will also be sent in a follow-up email. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website by the end of the week. And Jose Juan, thank you so much. It was wonderful. And hope everyone has a great day, and reach out if you need anything. Thank you so much. And yes, you will get a copy of the slides. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.